A serial killer emerges. It was a time of cultural upheaval and widespread social change, the 1970s in America. The Vietnam War loomed large, civil rights movements pressed forward, and amid the chaos, a sinister figure lurked in the shadows. Initially unnoticed by police, media, and even the communities he preyed upon, this killer targeted individuals who were often overlooked by society. Vulnerable women, often sex workers or those considered marginalized, became unwilling participants in a macabre story that would unfold across a massive stretch of the United States. This killer's modus operandi was painfully constructed. He didn't operate in a single city, nor did he strike in predictable intervals. His movements were as erratic as they were calculated. Spanning more than a dozen states, his trail was composed of fear, brutality, and precise planning. He understood the world of his victims: lonely streets, dim motel rooms, the far edges of towns where lights barely reached, and used that understanding to vanish before law enforcement could piece the puzzle together. While newspapers of the time reported some murders, they rarely connected the dots. Women found strangled in alleys by dumpsters or discarded in woods began to seem like isolated incidents rather than part of a greater, more terrifying scheme. Society, with its prejudices, largely dismissed the patterns emerging in these deaths. After all, who'd take notice of women whose lives were already entrenched in hardship? It was an era when victims like these weren't granted the media spotlight that could rally national attention. The killer himself, in retrospect, proved incredibly elusive. Charming when necessary, completely detached when it served his purpose, he moved through communities and urban landscapes like a ghost. He'd take jobs that demanded little identification or accountability, blend in despite his unique physical build and demeanor, and always picked victims who wouldn't be immediately missed. For years, his actions were a grim secret shared only between him and his victims. He carefully honed his methods, choosing strangulation as his signature, believing it left no mess, and allowed him to fully control the final moments of his victims. Investigators now speculate that this also fed his psychological need for dominance, as each strangulation apparently brought him what he later described as an indescribable high. What made him most terrifying wasn't just the number of lives he claimed, though still countless, but the brazen way he navigated the gaps in law enforcement. This was before advanced technologies like DNA mapping or centralized crime databases. America's justice system was fragmented between jurisdictions, and many crimes went unnoticed in the shuffle of bureaucracy. A murder in one state wasn't linked to another across state lines. This gave the killer room to grow more confident, methodical, and inevitably, more deadly. By the mid-1980s, whispers of serial attacks began surfacing among investigative circles. Some detectives posited that these deaths might be related, a chilling pattern of neglect, marginalization, and predation. But without clear evidence, those theories dissolved into the background. Local police departments were overwhelmed enough with daily crimes and lacked the resources or cross-communication to dig deeper. What surfaced was a map of disconnected tragedies, each horrifying in its own right but obscured in the larger network of American crime. Decades would pass before the full scope of his malevolence would come to light. The killer, now operating almost as if immune to consequences, left behind a history that painted the stark realities of not just his personal depravity, but also the failure of a society too fragmented to see the predator hiding in plain sight. Breakthrough in the investigation. For years the crimes remained dark whispers, a handful of disconnected tragedies buried under the weight of bureaucratic silence. Police departments, stretched thin and plagued by fragmented jurisdictions, simply didn't tie these deaths together. Each homicide, gruesome as it was, appeared to be isolated, just another casualty of an unforgiving world. Then came the fateful day, September 5, 2012, a seemingly routine Wednesday that would change everything. It began with a tip, a whisper about a man dealing drugs out of a makeshift shelter for the homeless in Louisville, Kentucky. When California police decided to act on this information, they could never have imagined the enormity of what they were walking into. What they thought would be an ordinary arrest in a long line of small-time criminals would instead become the unlock to a mystery spanning over 40 years. The man they apprehended was Samuel Little, a frail, 72-year-old with a past so littered with offenses it read like an encyclopedia of crime. Burglary, assault, theft, drug dealing. His extensive rap sheet was proof that Samuel had danced on the periphery of the law for decades without fully getting caught. At first glance, he might have seemed like nothing more than an aging petty criminal, just another name to filter through the system. But when the police collected a routine DNA sample, the ripple effect it would generate was nothing short of extraordinary. Once entered into the CODIS system, a national database of DNA profiles, it was like a bomb went off. The DNA from Samuel Little was not only in the system but matched evidence from not one, but 3 long cold murder cases out of Los Angeles. The kind of cold cases that haunted detectives for decades, where victims remained voiceless and clues fell through the cracks. Each of the crimes bore striking similarities. All young women, all deceased by strangulation, bodies discarded like refuse in out-of-sight locations. The first was Carol Alford, found on July 13, 1987, outside a grimy Los Angeles alley near a dumpster. The second, Guadalupe Apodaca, located in an abandoned auto shop on September 3, 1987. The third, Audrey Nelson, discovered in August 1989, her body stuffed unceremoniously into a trash container. All 3 sent shockwaves through their communities at the time, but their stories quickly faded, lost in the noise of a chaotic city. What tied them together now, over 20 years later, was Samuel Little's DNA, a silent witness to his chilling permanence in their final moments. Forensic analysts and detectives couldn't ignore the mounting evidence. It wasn't just a coincidence or a mistake, the pattern was undeniable. The California investigators knew they had stumbled upon something far bigger than initially imagined, and it lit a fire under them. Samuel Little, however, remained calm. When questioned about the match, he denied it quietly, almost as if the deaths were beneath his memory. To outward appearances, it could seem like he had finally been caught in a web of his own making, yet this was a man who had survived decades of evading the law. He had faced arrests, trials, even accusations, and yet every time the justice system let him slip away. Los Angeles detectives began digging deeper, pulling up every thread that might help define who Samuel Little really was. What they found was a man with an extraordinary history of deviance, nearly 100 arrests across the country, a list of offenses so long it boggled the mind, assaults, thefts, attempted murders, and strangulations. Always strangulations. It was his hallmark, and the match to DNA evidence now proved it wasn't a coincidence. Still, questions remained. How far did his crimes go? How many victims were there? And why had it taken this long to uncover the larger picture? What really hit home for investigators, though, was the sheer system failure that had let Little roam free for over 4 decades. His status as a transient, a man who moved across states and operated in the underbelly of society, made it so easy for him to slip between the cracks. Local police forces rarely collaborated across borders, and advanced technology like DNA testing only came onto the scene in recent years. By the time any one agency knew his name, Samuel had already moved on, leaving a cold trail and a grieving, forgotten community behind. What detectives didn't yet realize was that the 3 Los Angeles murders were only the tip of the iceberg. As investigators began unlocking the timeline of his life, a pattern emerged that went far beyond California, stretching across Texas, Florida, Nevada, Louisiana, and beyond. Women from all walks of life, many vulnerable, many isolated, had crossed paths with Samuel Little, and the results were almost always the same. The breakthrough in 2012 wasn't just a victory for Los Angeles detectives, it was the beginning of a nightmare unraveling. Samuel Little, now under arrest and sitting in a stark interrogation room, held secrets spanning generations. Investigators were standing at the edge of a dark abyss that would take years to fully explore, and Samuel Little, for his part, seemed to know this all too well. He didn't shout, he didn't panic, he didn't cry out for mercy. The man who would soon be known as one of America's most prolific serial killers simply waited, eyes calculating as if daring them to uncover the full truth. That truth would take time, years in fact, to come into focus. But on that fateful day in Louisville, Kentucky, the investigation shifted forever. The name Samuel Little would no longer be confined to a dusty file in a records room. It was a name that the world would soon come to know, etched into the macabre annals of American history. The 3 Los Angeles murders. Between 1987 and 1989, amid the sprawling chaos of Los Angeles, its bright lights and darkened alleys, 3 murders went largely unnoticed by the public eye, buried under the city's endless headlines of crime, political disputes, and celebrity scandals. But these 3 murders, horrifying in their similarity, would eventually become the keys to unraveling one of the most prolific killing sprees in American history. The first murder, Carol Alford. It was a sweltering summer day, July 13, 1987, when the body of 41-year-old Carol Alford was discovered in a grimy alley near a Los Angeles dumpster. The stench of garbage and decay had drawn the attention of a passerby, who, upon closer inspection, stumbled upon the lifeless form of a woman. The scene was haunting. Carol lay crumpled on the ground, bruises painting her neck and face like a brutal map of her final moments. Strangulation marks were clear on her throat, evidence of the struggle that ultimately stole her life. Carol had spent much of her life navigating the tenuous edges of society, struggling to carve out even a modest existence. She wasn't anyone the newspapers or public would rally around. Her death was just another headline in a city grappling with crime waves. As police investigated, they quickly ran out of leads. There were no witnesses, no clearly identifiable suspects, and the case quickly turned cold. Carol's murder might have remained one of a million forgotten tragedies, but years later her story would resurface in the most chilling way. The second murder, Guadalupe Apodaca. Less than 2 months later, on September 3, 1987, the next victim emerged. 46-year-old Guadalupe Apodaca. Her body was found sprawled on the cold concrete floor of an abandoned auto repair shop in a neglected part of town. The once vibrant workshop, now a derelict ruin, became the silent witness to her final, horrifying moments. Police examining the scene observed striking similarities to Carol's case. Guadalupe, like Carol, had ligature marks on her neck from strangulation and showed signs of having been brutally assaulted. The violence was intimate, personal, and calculated, hallmarks of a killer who thrived on controlling his victims' final breaths. Guadalupe's death unsettled the local law enforcement, but with limited forensic tools available in the 1980s, they found themselves grasping at straws. Guadalupe's story echoed a painful truth about society's neglect of its most vulnerable: a mother, a daughter, a victim whose life became a statistic. Her case too went cold, filed away with little hope that justice would ever be served. The third murder, Audrey Nelson. Fast forward to August 14, 1989. Audrey Nelson, just 35 years old, was discovered in an even more grotesque manner, in a trash container, her body dumped like garbage. For detectives who responded to the crime scene, it was a moment they'd never forget. Audrey's body bore the now all too familiar signs of strangulation, her once vibrant energy extinguished by the same brutal force. Audrey's life resembled that of many others in her position. She had faced hardship after hardship, living on the fringes of an unforgiving society. Like Carol and Guadalupe before her, she had been a victim not just of a heinous crime but of a world that viewed people like her as disposable. The media barely gave her death-passing acknowledgement, the kind of apathy that would embolden her killer to strike again. The chilling pattern, a killer's signature. Though police weren't yet able to connect the dots, the pattern was emerging with terrifying clarity. A predator was haunting Los Angeles. He wasn't rushing his work, he wasn't careless. He stalked his victims, women who were often overlooked, who wouldn't be immediately missed, and who he believed no one would fight for. His choice of strangulation wasn't arbitrary, it gave him total control over his victims. It was deliberate, it was dominating, and, perhaps most chillingly, it was repeatable. Each of the women killed shared strikingly similar profiles. They were women fighting personal battles, living in vulnerable situations, and often navigating the complexities of addiction, poverty, or social ostracism. To the killer, these struggles made them perfect prey. They were invisible to the very systems meant to protect them, but not to him. He saw them, hunted them, lured them in, and then, systematically and cruelly, ended their lives. The investigators' blind spots. At the time, these three cases weren't considered related. The idea of a serial killer stalking the streets of Los Angeles wasn't on anyone's radar. The lack of coordination between jurisdictions, coupled with the fractured nature of the criminal justice system, allowed the killer to slip through unnoticed. Evidence wasn't shared. Patterns weren't identified. Local police departments were overwhelmed and underfunded, leaving each investigation siloed and disjointed. Los Angeles in the 1980s was a city bursting at the seams with crime. Gangs, drugs, and murders saturated the headlines. Detectives were overrun with cases, and the victims in these three murders didn't stand out, at least not in the way victims of high-profile cases might. Carol, Guadalupe, and Audrey were women whose lives and deaths occurred almost entirely in the shadows. What went unnoticed? Had the police at the time possessed the tools of modern forensics, or the resources to collaborate with one another, The pattern in these murders might have been spotted, but in the late 1980s, things like DNA matching or centralized criminal databases were science fiction. A strangulation here, a body dumped there. It all felt random, a tragic reality of urban life rather than the work of one calculating, remorseless killer. It wouldn't be until decades later, thanks to advancements in forensic science and the relentless determination of investigators, that these three cases would finally be connected. What had once seemed like isolated acts of violence would reveal themselves to be the work of one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. The unfolding nightmare. When DNA evidence connected Samuel Little to these three murders, it sent shockwaves through both the law enforcement community and the public. The realization that a single man, already in his 70s and virtually unnoticed for decades, could be responsible for such heinous crimes was both stunning and sobering. For Carol, Guadalupe, and Audrey, the connection brought long overdue attention to their stories. But for investigators, the cases opened a floodgate. These three murders were only the beginning. The true scope of Samuel Little's evil would soon come to light, exposing a darkness that stretched far beyond Los Angeles. The background of a prolonged crime. To understand how Samuel Little managed to commit such unspeakable acts for decades without being caught, we need to look closely at his life, at the cracks in the justice system, and at the unseen corners of society where he thrived. His story isn't just one of a man's depravity, it's also the story of how a network of failures allowed him to slip through for so long. The drifter lifestyle, flying under the radar. Samuel Little never put down roots. He was by design a drifter, a man without a fixed address, without overt ties to any one place, and with little to nothing to connect him to the victims he hunted. This nomadic lifestyle not only allowed him to evade suspicion but also made it difficult for law enforcement to track him across state lines. Little kept himself mobile, bouncing between motels and shelters, taking transient jobs that required little identification, or living out of his car. In a country as wide and variable as the United States, he used the vastness of the geography to his advantage. From Florida's humid swamps to California's sprawling urban jungles, from dusty Texas highways to quiet Appalachian towns, he moved like a ghost, preying on women who no one else seemed to notice. A system ill-equipped for a monster like him. The America of the 1970s, 80s, and even 90s was vastly different from today when it came to law enforcement and crime detection. Back then, there was no centralized database that could connect crimes across jurisdictions. Each state, and indeed each city, operated their own police departments, often with little communication between them. A murder in Florida stayed in Florida. A missing person in Nevada was no concern for California. Fragmented, disconnected, and often overwhelmed, the justice system became Samuel Little's greatest ally. The lack of modern forensic techniques also played into his hands. DNA profiling, something we take so much for granted today, didn't exist for most of his murderous career. Even in the 1990s, it was still a relatively new and underutilized tool. Blood samples, bodily fluids, fingerprints, evidence that would now lead straight to a suspect, often went untested or were inconclusive in the era before scientific advancements caught up with the crimes. But beyond mere technical failings, there was the human factor. Samuel Little deliberately chose a specific kind of victim, often women living on the fringes of society, sex workers, drug addicts, single mothers struggling with homelessness. He targeted women who tragically society often overlooked or ignored. The deaths of these women didn't prompt a media firestorm or a special task force. Their cases quietly faded into police file cabinets where they remained untouched for decades. A lifetime of crime, a pattern overlooked before becoming the man the FBI would later call America's most prolific serial killer. Samuel Little was already a career criminal. His rap sheet read like a catalog of misdeeds: assaults, thefts, DUIs, armed robberies, attempted kidnappings. Each crime was serious in its own right, and yet he rarely spent significant time behind bars. Again and again he was arrested, tried, and either freed due to lack of evidence or let go after serving a shockingly short sentence. A revolving door of law enforcement helped feed his confidence. He became a master of telling police what they wanted to hear. He was charming when arrested, denying wrongdoing in a calm and collected manner that convinced many he was just a misunderstood drifter. Prosecutors struggled to convince juries to convict him because many of his victims, sex workers or drug addicts, were unwilling or unable to testify. In one particularly revealing event in 1984, Samuel was arrested in Mississippi after a woman accused him of kidnapping her, assaulting her, and attempting to strangle her. She escaped, barely with her life, and testified against him in court. But without strong forensic evidence to back her claim, the jury deemed her story insufficient to convict. Samuel walked free, smiling. Years later it became clear she had been one of the few to survive an encounter with him, hiding in plain sight. Samuel Little weaponized society's prejudice. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that women of color, particularly those working in the sex trade or dealing with addiction, were at the absolute bottom rung of the social hierarchy. Their disappearances rarely made headlines. When they turned up dead, the narrative was often one of blame. They were in dangerous professions, making risky choices. Few people questioned why they were killed, they simply accepted it as a grim reality of life in the margins. Little chose his victims strategically, admitting later that he specifically avoided killing women everyone would look for. In his view, if you go to murder a rich white lady, everybody's going to be after you, but if it was a struggling black sex worker, nobody cares. This systemic apathy, rooted in racism, classism, and sexism, was his shield. For decades, he committed his crimes virtually unnoticed, operating in a world that seemed to shrug at the plight of its most vulnerable. His signature: strangulation in silence. One of the most chilling aspects of Samuel Little's crimes was his consistent method of murder. He preferred strangulation, not only because it left little physical evidence for police, but because it allowed him to feel complete control over his victims. He described his crimes not with remorse, but as passion. In chilling confessions, he confessed to watching the life leave his victims' eyes, calling it an intimate experience that no one could take from him. For him, it wasn't just about killing, it was about domination, about creating a power dynamic where he held absolute authority over whether his victims lived or died. Detectives later speculated that this, above all else, drove his compulsion to kill. It wasn't about sex, it wasn't about money, it was about control, the perfect storm of factors. Samuel Little's ability to evade capture for so long was a perfect storm of circumstance: a broken system, a lack of resources, a widespread societal indifference to the victims he chose. His geographical mobility meant police across different states never had the chance to compare notes or see a pattern. His relatively minor criminal charges, drugs, theft, drunken brawls, kept him in the spotlight just long enough to be arrested, but never long enough to face true justice. By the time law enforcement began piecing his decades-long killing spree together, his victim count had grown higher than anyone could have imagined. He had operated under the radar for so long that entire generations of police officers retired without ever knowing his name, and through it all, Little remained coldly calculated, a master manipulator of not just his victims, but the systems meant to hold him accountable. It wasn't until his final arrest in 2012 and the advent of modern DNA technology that the walls finally began to close in. The shocking confessions. By 2013, after decades of evading capture, Samuel Little was finally convicted of 3 brutal murders, earning him 3 life sentences without the possibility of parole. But to him, those murders, Carol Alford, Guadalupe Apodaca, and Audrey Nelson, were only fragments of a much larger, much darker story. While he initially maintained his innocence in court, the years that followed his conviction would shake the foundations of law enforcement and criminal investigations across the United States forever. It began quietly. Little, now in his 70s, sat in a prison cell that seemed all too comfortable for a man who had lived his life with complete freedom. Old age and time had a way of softening his bravado, but not his cunning. And then came a moment no one could have anticipated. In 2018, Samuel Little offered law enforcement an unbelievable deal. In exchange for being moved to a facility with better conditions, preferably one with access to amenities for aging inmates, he would talk. And not just any kind of talk. Samuel proposed to tell investigators about murders no one even knew had happened. It was a proposition that sounded almost too surreal to be true. But the detectives, led by Texas Ranger James Holland, decided to listen. What they heard in the following year was nothing short of horrifying. "I've done more than you think." Once the cameras started rolling, Samuel Little began a series of confessions that would fracture even the most hardened investigators. Sitting in an interrogation room, completely calm and steady, he spoke with the casual tone of someone recounting old war stories, not horrific murders. He didn't stutter or shy away from the details. Instead, he leaned into them with a chilling level of precision. "Y'all think I killed a few," he he said nonchalantly, "but I've done more than you think, a lot more." With those few chilling words, Samuel began pulling back the curtain on a nightmare that spanned 5 decades. He admitted nonchalantly to killing 93 people between 1970 and 2005. 93. In a world where the devil exists in details, Samuel provided plenty of those. Only the details weren't the product of fiction. They were cold, haunting truths from a man who had violently stolen lives for most of his adult existence. Describing murders with exacting detail. Samuel's memory wasn't like most people's. While he struggled to remember exact dates or even the names of some of his victims, his mind was photographic when it came to faces and locations. "I'll never forget a face," he frequently boasted, as though his memory were a badge of honor. And disturbingly, it was true. Interview after interview revealed the same pattern. Samuel described his victims as though they were old acquaintances. He could recall what they wore, the way they smelled, the exact curve of their smiles. He even remembered the colors of their eyes. But most chilling were the moments leading up to, and during, the murders. He was ruthlessly candid, almost eager when recounting how he strangled the life out of them. Investigators recorded hours of footage that showed Samuel recalling these acts with no remorse, only a strange satisfaction in retelling his story. One by one he revealed the lives he had stolen. A woman from Arkansas in 1984 who he killed in the woods near a creek, another from Florida dumped by a swamp, a third from Nevada left to die in a car, and countless others, each more heartbreaking than the last, scattered across 19 states like clues to a gruesome puzzle. In some cases he would pause mid-confession, close his eyes, and smile faintly. "She was a fighter," he'd say, as though it were a twisted compliment. The way he spoke of the murders still haunts those who listened. Even the most experienced police found themselves shaken by his calm demeanor. For Samuel Little, death was not just a habit, it was an art form, one he orchestrated quietly in the back streets of America. Sketches of his victims. Perhaps one of the most jarring developments in his confessions was his willingness, and almost eagerness, to assist investigations. Knowing that many of his victims had gone years, even decades, without proper identification, Samuel began sketching them. With nothing but colored pencils and an artist's pad, he created haunting portraits of the women he had murdered, sometimes decades earlier. Each sketch was filled with stunning detail, hair color, eye shape, lip fullness, every feature carefully recreated from his memory. "These are my babies," he once said with a peculiar fondness. "I remember all of them." The portraits were eerie treasures for law enforcement. Many of his victims' cases had long gone cold, their names reduced to numbers or Jane Doe labels in dusty police archives. With these sketches, investigators began matching Samuel's recollections with real missing persons, giving families answers they had sought for years. It was a bittersweet breakthrough. Samuel brought closure, but he also reopened wounds for communities and families who thought they had moved on. A mind of control and calculation. As Samuel's confessions poured out, one common theme became clear. His murders, though opportunistic in nature, were not without purpose. Each victim was carefully selected, not in advance but in the moment when Samuel felt he had the perfect opportunity. He admitted to targeting women he believed wouldn't be immediately missed, women who lived on society's edge, often struggling with addiction, homelessness, or sex work. "I never killed no ladies everybody wanted," he confessed. "They were out there on the streets. Nobody would care if they went missing." The chilling thing was, Samuel wasn't wrong. His deadly spree was made possible, in part, by the apathy of a world that didn't see the value in every human life. To him, undetected murder was simply logistics. He preyed on the vulnerable, the invisible, those who seemed forgotten before they even crossed his path. The national ripple effect. By the time law enforcement had pieced together the full scope of Samuel's story, the numbers were staggering. Out of the 93 murders he confessed to, the FBI was able to confirm at least 50 with solid evidence. Investigators across the country scrambled to reopen cases, comb old records, and compare his sketches to missing persons. His story sent shockwaves through the justice system, raising questions about how one man could escape accountability for so long. No guilt, only legacy. One thing remained clear throughout Samuel's confessions: he felt no guilt. In fact, his confessions often felt like vanity projects, showcasing the legacy he had left in his wake. He wasn't just admitting to these crimes, he was taking ownership of them, as though each one added to his image as an infamous serial killer. The shocking nature of Samuel Little's confessions wasn't just in the sheer numbers, it was in the way he told his tale. There was no remorse, no pity, and no regard for the victims or their families. For decades he had kept their stories hidden, and when he finally revealed them, it was with the pride of a man unveiling a monstrous masterpiece. He confesses to the murder of Denise brothers. In the maze of confessions that Samuel Little unraveled in 2018, one name stood out: Denise Christie brothers. Her name was just one among the many lives Samuel recounted stealing, but her story carried a chilling resonance, a final heartbreaking chapter in a desperate tale of survival at the margins. Denise brothers wasn't all that different from many of Samuel's other victims. She lived a life that teetered on the edge of society, marked by the struggles of poverty, addiction, and the harmful cycles that often come with them. Born and raised in Texas, Denise had once been someone's little girl, someone's sister, someone's dreamer. But life, as it often does, pulled her down winding paths she didn't choose. She battled her demons as best she could. Like many who fall through society's cracks, she turned to sex work as a way to survive. It was a dangerous path, one that left her exposed to predators and a harsh world that rarely looked out for people like her. In early 1994, the lives of Denise and Samuel Little would collide in the quiet Texas town of Odessa, a grim intersection of desperation and pure evil. The day Denise disappeared. It was February 1994, and Denise was last seen walking down a strip of road on one of Odessa's rundown avenues. Her family would later recall how she had seemed distracted in the days leading up to her disappearance. Denise had promised her sister she'd visit soon. Unbeknownst to her family, these would be her last interactions with them. Like so many sex workers, Denise had learned to survive on instinct and intuition, but nothing could prepare her for falling into the hands of Samuel Little. Little had drifted into town like a specter, as he often did. Odessa, with its dusty streets and isolated corners, presented him with the perfect hunting ground. Little later described how he would seek out quiet locations, areas where he could slide into the shadows unnoticed. He would earn their trust, or at least disarm their suspicions. "I just offer them a ride," he said nonchalantly in his confessions years later. His hunting technique was methodical, sinister, yet simple. On that fateful day, Samuel approached Denise. Maybe he feigned kindness, or maybe he mentioned the money she needed. Whatever he said, he convinced her to get into his car. What Denise didn't realize until it was too late was that Samuel Little's signature pattern was already in motion, the first step in what would become her final hours, a cold-blooded crime. In Samuel's chilling recollection of that night, what followed could only be described as calculated cruelty. He drove her to a secluded area just outside Odessa, far from curious eyes and the safety of crowded streets. The open, desolate Texas terrain became the backdrop for Denise's last moments. He offered her no mercy, no chance of escape. As was his method with most of his victims, he strangled Denise with his bare hands. To Samuel it was personal and deliberate. The control it brought him fed his dark obsession. "I loved it," he confessed in stark, emotionless detail years later. The struggle, the fear, the ending, it was never rushed or impulsive, it was ritualistic. What's chilling is how resigned he claimed his victims would become in their final seconds, as though they slowly realized there was no way out. When Denise was lifeless, Samuel left her body discarded, abandoned like refuse. To him, she was no longer a person. She had become part of his macabre collection. Her body was later discovered in a field on the outskirts of Odessa, the expansive landscape swallowing any hope of witnesses or immediate answers. For her family, her death was a tragedy, but one without closure or clarity. Decades of unanswered questions. For years, Denise's family tried to piece together what had happened. Like countless victims of Samuel Little, she was mourned quietly, with no national headlines or media attention to rally a search for her killer. Her name faded into the background, just another casualty in an often cruel and indifferent world. Police opened an investigation, but without clear leads or suspects, it quickly went cold. The 80s and 90s were a time before advanced forensics could provide breakthroughs. Strangulation left little evidence, and for women like Denise, living on the edges of society, justice often moved too slowly, if it moved at all. Her family held on to her memory. They fought not to let her story disappear entirely, even as years marched forward, and the need for answers burned painfully in the backs of their minds. But those answers wouldn't come, not until decades later when Samuel Little finally decided to talk. The chilling confession. In 2018, when Little began confessing, his memory of Denise brothers surfaced with shocking clarity. Sitting in an interrogation room, his words painted vivid and horrifying pictures of her last moments. He spoke without hesitation or guilt, describing exactly how he took Denise's life. He talked about how they met, how powerless she was, how he felt as he killed her. "She was from Odessa," he said in one confession. "I took her out by a field. I killed her. She was small, but she was feisty." Those simple, spine-chilling statements sent shockwaves through law enforcement. To them, Denise wasn't just another case being solved. She was a symbol of how many women Samuel had preyed upon, women who simply slipped between the cracks. Using his confession and subsequent sketches he drew of Denise and the crime scene, police confirmed the remains found in the field in 1994 did indeed belong to her. After more than 20 years, her family finally had confirmation of the nightmare scenario they had feared all along. Denise hadn't just disappeared, she had been chosen, hunted, and murdered by a serial killer who had taken dozens of other lives. A heartbreaking legacy. Denise Christie brothers became one of the many puzzle pieces that revealed the enormity of Samuel Little's crimes. Her story, though tragic, was part of a greater reckoning, a moment when law enforcement finally began connecting the dots on a killer who thought he could outlast justice. For her family, the closure came with a heavy sadness. Learning the truth after so many years doesn't erase the pain. Instead, it sharpens the loss. Denise wasn't just another victim of Samuel Little. She was a woman with a life, a past, and people who loved her. In losing her, her family lost a piece of themselves. While the name Denise Brothers may never dominate the headlines like other infamous victims of high-profile crimes, her story matters. Not just to those who loved her, but as part of the painful history of neglect, indifference, and systemic failure that allowed Samuel Little to commit his unfathomable crimes for decades. Samuel Little died in prison in 2020, leaving behind a long trail of devastation. But for Denise's family and countless others, the confessions he made during his final years at least brought some semblance of light to the darkness he had created. The method behind target selection. If evil thrives in the shadows, then Samuel Little's calculated methodology of selecting his victims was the perfect embodiment of darkness. Over the decades, as his victim count climbed into shocking numbers, his methods for choosing who lived and who died revealed a sinister genius rooted in cold pragmatism and a twisted personal philosophy. He wasn't impulsive, quite the opposite. He was patient, calculating, and relentless. Samuel's victims weren't chosen randomly. To him, they represented more than just opportunity. They were the perfect prey, vulnerable, forgotten, invisible. He identified them with the precision of a predator under cover of moral apathy and societal neglect. In his later confessions, Samuel described his process in vivid detail, stripping away any remnants of humanity and revealing a cunning strategy that thrived on the indifference of the world. The perfect target, vulnerability over value. Samuel admitted unequivocally that he sought out women living on the fringes of society. His ideal victim list shared a few hauntingly similar traits. They were often women of color, sex workers, drug addicts, or individuals struggling with homelessness. These women were too often seen, even by law enforcement, as less than. In a world that barely noticed their daily struggles, he calculated they wouldn't be missed if they disappeared, and chillingly, he was right. "I never killed no ladies everybody cared about," Samuel confessed with an unapologetic bluntness during an interrogation in 2018. "Rich white ladies? People go looking for them, but the ones I picked? Nobody's gonna care if they're gone. They belong to the streets." In his warped view, these women's lives existed without value in the eyes of society, and he took full advantage. His words were not just a reflection of his depravity, but an indictment of the social systems that allowed someone like him to stalk his victims for decades without consequence. A predator's eye for weakness. Samuel's hunting grounds were carefully chosen. He liked urban areas, places large enough to get lost in, where a transient nobody like him could come and go without raising suspicion. He spent years prowling places like Los Angeles, Houston, Miami, and Las Vegas, where anonymity thrived, and he blended into the chaos of overburdened streets and underfunded communities. But location wasn't the only factor. He also had an unerring instinct for spotting vulnerability. His approach was almost predatory in the wildest sense of the word. He didn't just select women who seemed down on their luck. He looked for behavioral cues that they were perfect candidates. Women standing alone by street corners, looking unsure or nervous, were easy targets. Those desperate for money, food, or support, or those with signs of fatigue from battling addiction, stood out like beacons to him. He could zero in on their weaknesses in an instant. In interviews, Little described how he approached his victims with charm. "You gotta act polite, act like you care," he once told investigators. "That'll make them let their guard down. Ain't nobody scared of an old man like me." His disarming demeanor was his weapon, lulling his victims into believing he was harmless. He even claimed he could tell immediately which women wanted out of their situation. Once he knew he could manipulate them, the trap was set. Using the shadows of prejudice, Samuel Little didn't just target vulnerability, he targeted indifference, racism, sexism, classism, all the societal inequalities that labeled certain individuals as less important were factors Samuel exploited in his reign of terror. He was aware, perhaps more than most, that his victims were marginalized not just by him, but by the world they lived in. If a wealthy middle-class woman from a suburban neighborhood went missing, it would make the evening news. Headlines would scream, search teams would mobilize, and communities would rally for justice. If one of Samuel's victims, a black sex worker living on the streets, disappeared? Not so much. Cases like hers rarely warranted even a paragraph in the local paper. Police departments with limited resources often placed these disappearances at the bottom of their priority lists. Samuel leaned into this disparity with precision. They were the kind of women society didn't care about, he admitted, so who was going to come looking for them? In his confessions, he sounded not just confident, but smug. He knew he had been protected all along by a system that neglected his victims. The illusion of kindness. One of the most dangerous aspects of Little's methodology was his ability to appear harmless. He wasn't the lurking, knife-wielding monster you'd see in a horror movie. Instead, he came across as unassuming, even friendly. His victims rarely saw him as a threat. After all, he was just an older man offering a ride or a conversation. His calm demeanor made it all too easy for desperate women to lower their guard. These small acts of supposed kindness, offering food, conversation, or a place to rest, were nothing more than deceptions to establish control. He would earn their trust just long enough to isolate them, remove them from public view, and make his move. Once he had them in his car, alone and disoriented, his carefully curated facade dropped, replaced by cold efficiency and cruelty. The psychology of control. Samuel was driven not just by the act of murder itself, but by the control it gave him over his victims. To him, the most intimate, dominating act was strangulation. Unlike a gunshot or stabbing, strangulation allowed him to dictate every second of his victims' final moments. "I like to watch them," he confessed, his words dripping with detachment. "You feel them stop fighting back, that's when I knew I won." This disturbing fixation on domination wasn't just about violence, it was about power. Samuel felt like a god in those moments. He chose who lived and who died, relishing in the absolute control he had over those who crossed his path. For decades his murders weren't impulsive or sloppy, they were orchestrated, each one following his dark, calculated ritual. Staying invisible. The mobility factor. Another key aspect of Samuel's method was his transient lifestyle. He never stayed anywhere too long. After murdering a victim in one state, he would drive hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles to a new location, ensuring that no single police department had enough of a pattern to track his crimes. Motels, truck stops, highway diners, these were his homes. His freedom of movement, combined with the lack of interstate cooperation between police at the time, made him virtually untraceable. A murder in Mississippi would be forgotten by the time he was prowling the streets of California. Law enforcement's lack of nationwide data sharing during the 1970s and 80s meant that Samuel's crimes were isolated incidents, never part of the larger picture forming in his wake. A legacy of neglect and pain. Years later, his methods would be analyzed and dissected not just by criminologists but by society at large, as a terrifying reminder of how prejudice and indifference can embolden a predator. Samuel Little operated in a vacuum where his victims were invisible, his crimes unnoticed, and his existence unchallenged. He didn't just slip through the cracks in the system, he thrived in them. In the end, it wasn't just Samuel Little's cunning that allowed his spree to last over 40 years. It was a perfect storm of systemic failure, a fractured criminal justice system, outdated forensic methods, and a culture all too willing to overlook the struggling women he preyed upon. His victims deserved better than what the world gave them. The killer's unbelievable memory. Among all the characteristics that defined Samuel Little, his manipulative charm, his nomadic lifestyle, and his chilling lack of remorse, there was one trait that astonished investigators and set him apart from the archetype of a serial killer: his unparalleled, almost photographic memory. While most serial killers leave behind evidence, witnesses, or some semblance of patterns, Little relied almost entirely on his own recollection of his crimes, a fact that baffled even the most experienced detectives. His mind, as dark and twisted as it was, functioned like an archive of horrors, containing details about murders that spanned more than 50 years. Samuel Little not only remembered the women he killed, but could recount the specific moments leading up to their deaths, with a precision that sent chills through the spines of everyone who heard his confessions. His memory offered both a key to solving decades-long mysteries and a window into the disturbing thoughts of one of history's most prolific serial killers. I'll never forget a face. The first striking feature of Little's memory was his ability to recall faces. Investigators who interviewed him were shocked by the vividness of his recollections, even though many of these crimes had been committed decades earlier. Little claimed, with an air of odd pride, that he never forgot a victim's face. "I'll never forget a face," he repeated often during his confessions, and he meant it. For most people, memories fade with time, faces blur, details dissolve into the fog of bygone years. But Samuel Little's memories were frozen in time. He carried the faces of his victims in the dark corners of his mind, each etched with vivid clarity, as if memorialized by the very acts of violence he committed against them. In hours of interviews with Texas Ranger James Holland, Little provided cringingly specific details about each victim. While he struggled to remember some names or exact dates, he could describe their physical appearances with shocking precision. He could remember hairstyles, clothing patterns, body shapes, and even the color of their eyes. For those involved in the investigation, it became clear that Little's mind functioned less like a memory bank and more like a gallery of the dead, a mental exhibit of the women he had killed. Sketching the past, portraits of his victims. As part of an unconventional and chilling move, Samuel Little began sketching his victims at the request of law enforcement. Using nothing more than a few colored pencils and some paper, he recreated hauntingly accurate portraits. Women who had often been forgotten by society, and in many cases even by their families. Each drawing was a reflection of Little's rare and disturbing ability to recall visual details. Their faces bore a startling lifelike quality, the curve of a cheekbone, the angle of a jawline, lips either pursed in thought or relaxed in quiet moments now lost. The women came back to life in haunting technicolor, decades after they met their tragic ends. He referred to these drawings as his babies. "These are my babies," Samuel Little said to investigators with an odd pride in his voice. "I remember all of them." The portraits were unnerving in their intimacy. For detectives, it was both a breakthrough and an emotional burden. Many of the women in his sketches were never formally reported as missing. Some had drifted to the margins of society and stayed there, their lives disappearing into the background noise of urban America. Little's confessions, combined with the eerily accurate portraits, brought their stories at long last back into focus. The sketches became a crucial tool for investigators trying to close decades-old cold cases. As they showed them to communities, families, and local law enforcement, links between the drawings and real missing persons began to emerge. For some families, who had long feared the worst and lived with unanswered questions for years, the portraits were the first step toward closure. Snapshots of horror, memory, as a weapon. What made Little's ability so unique wasn't just the clarity of his recollections but how he used these memories as a weapon. To him, each face, each recollected moment of terror was a trophy, a reminder of the control he had exerted over his victims. His memory was tightly bound to his obsession with domination. Each time he recounted the color of a victim's dress, or the way her voice trembled in her final moments, he did so with the calm detachment of someone reading from a diary. "I took her out to the field," he once recounted, recalling a victim in Florida several decades earlier. "She had on this flowered dress. I'll never forget the way it moved in the wind after I killed her." For Little, these weren't just memories. They were vivid, locked-in snapshots of his most triumphant and intimate moments. Detectives began to understand that these recollections were more than records. They were part of what had kept Little going for so long. Reliving the details, holding on to the faces was a way of feeding his twisted need for gratification. Imperfect yet chillingly accurate. Though Samuel Little's ability to remember faces was near perfect, his recollections of dates and locations were frequently vague, further complicating the work of investigators. He might remember a victim's smell, her laughter, or the type of shoes she wore, but the exact year or even the city where the crime took place sometimes eluded him. This was unsurprising given the breadth of his crimes. With over 90 victims spanning more than 19 states and 5 decades, the timelines blurred. "I think it was around 79, he might say, only for investigators to discover the murder had taken place in 1982. Yet these temporal discrepancies didn't diminish the value of his memory. For law enforcement, even small breadcrumbs of information, combined with advances in DNA evidence, were enough to connect Little's victims to real missing persons. A mind unlike any other psychologists who later studied Samuel Little's behavior and confessions were fascinated by the uncanny precision of his mind. Some speculated that Little's extraordinary memory for faces and physical details might have been linked to his lifelong obsession with women. From childhood he harbored a fixation on certain features, particularly the neck, which later became central to his killings. This obsession may have heightened his focus, causing him to lock these details into his mind like a predator cataloging its prey. Others believed he possessed a natural ability akin to photographic memory, though warped toward violence and control. Regardless of the psychological explanation, his ability to recall faces decades after his crimes set him apart not just among criminals, but among humans in general. Legacy of a criminal mind. Samuel Little was finally stopped not by police intuition, but by science. His DNA linked him to 3 California murders, and his confessions did the rest. But it was his unparalleled memory, and his willingness to relive the darkest moments of his life that laid bare the full extent of his heinous acts. Through his recollections, dozens of cold cases were reopened, skeletal remains were identified, and grieving families finally learned what had happened to their loved ones. His ability to remember those he victimized, though horrifying, ultimately became a tool for investigators to shine a light on crimes that had long been swallowed by darkness. Revealing the shocking numbers. When Samuel Little began confessing to his murders, neither detectives nor the public could have fathomed the scale of his crimes. For decades, law enforcement had pursued individual cases: a woman murdered in a Florida swamp, another discarded in the woods of Mississippi, a young mother found dumped in a Los Angeles alley. These were tragedies, isolated and heartbreaking, but disconnected in ways that obscured the truth. It wasn't until Little started talking in 2018 that the world began to understand the monstrous legacy he had left behind. Samuel Little confessed to killing 93 women over a span of 35 years from 1970 to 2005, 93 lives. Each victim had a face, a name, a family, though many had been forgotten by society long before Little came into the picture. His crime spree spanned 19 states, crisscrossing America to create a roadmap of terror, dotted with unmarked graves and unanswered questions. What made these staggering numbers even more horrifying was how easily these murders went unnoticed, falling through the cracks of a fractured justice system. "I killed 93. The confession came quietly but landed like a thunderclap. Samuel Little, already serving life sentences for 3 murders, casually told investigators about the extent of his killings. He claimed he hadn't just committed murders. He had committed dozens, gleefully dodging capture at every turn. Detectives listened in stunned disbelief as he listed location after location, many of which were places where no murderer had ever been suspected. "I killed 93, he said without shame or hesitation, as though he were reading off a grocery list. While most serial killers operate in a relatively small radius, staying within a town or region, Samuel's dark web stretched across the United States. From Florida to California, Texas to Michigan, Alabama to Nevada, his victims came from every corner. Though his victims are tied together by method, strangulation, and circumstance, the alarming truth is that no national task force existed to see the threads connecting them until Little himself stitched them together during his confessions. The FBI confirms an unprecedented kill count. As Samuel confessed, law enforcement agencies across the country were struck by the enormity of the task before them. The FBI, long experienced in tracking patterns in serial killings, had never encountered numbers like those Samuel was claiming. 93 murders. Could it really be true? His claim seemed impossible, almost fantastical. Could one man have slipped through the fingers of American law enforcement that many times, in that many places? Investigators across multiple jurisdictions began re-examining their cold cases, looking for evidence that might align with Samuel's chilling recollections. To their horror, the numbers began to hold. By 2022, the FBI had confirmed that Samuel Little was in fact the perpetrator in at least 50 of those killings, based on verified evidence and DNA results. 50 cold cases were cracked open through his confessions, making him the most prolific serial killer in the history of the United States. Yet investigators believe that the final confirmed number may never reach the full 93. Too many of his victims remain unidentified, their final resting places long forgotten or erased by time. The weight of numbers. What does it mean to kill 93 people? It's hard to comprehend, to even imagine the scale of that trauma. That's 93 funerals, 93 families shattered, 93 lives extinguished by one man who preyed on the forgotten. The sheer weight of the numbers is staggering. In comparison, Ted Bundy confessed to 30 murders. John Wayne Gacy killed at least 33, and yet Samuel Little outpaced them all by decades and numbers, committing his heinous acts under the radar. And here's the most unsettling fact. For most of Samuel's victims, there were no search parties, no rallies for justice. Many of the women he targeted were already invisible to the world, unclaimed lives lost to addiction, poverty, or homelessness. By the time someone noticed they were missing, Samuel was already halfway across the country, erasing his trail with ruthless precision. How time worked to his advantage. How does a man kill 93 people and get away with it? The answer lies not just in his cunning, though Samuel Little was undoubtedly manipulative and careful, but in time itself. He began killing in the 1970s, a different era for law enforcement. There were no DNA databases, no interconnected crime-solving networks. Each state, each city operated in isolation, complicating communication between jurisdictions. A murder in Nevada wouldn't even be on the radar of detectives in Tennessee. Samuel thrived in this disconnected system, but his longevity as a killer came down to another darker factor: indifference. He knew that many of his victims, black women, sex workers, women struggling with mental health or substance use, would not be prioritized by law enforcement. "Nobody's gonna go looking," he said bluntly during one confession, and he was right. It wasn't until decades later, when advancements in forensic technology caught up and society began paying closer attention to crimes against marginalized groups, that the enormity of his crimes came to light. Victims without voices. Part of what makes Samuel Little's crimes so devastating is how few of his victims were ever properly mourned or even identified. In many cases, their families didn't even know they were dead, or had simply filed them away as missing persons decades before closure ever came. Some victims were labeled Jane Does and buried in unmarked graves miles away from their hometowns. Others were ignored entirely, their files gathering dust in forgotten police archives. "I didn't just kill them," Samuel said during one confession. "I picked them. They were mine." To him, the women weren't people with full, complicated lives. They were targets, opportunities, numbers in his growing tally. And until Samuel's confessions brought their stories back into the light, many of those lives had been erased as though they never existed at all. Lessons from the numbers. Samuel Little's staggering kill count isn't just a reflection of his personal evil. It's a reflection of systemic failure. The numbers tell a story of many lives lost, but they also raise critical questions for society. How did one man evade justice for so long? What cultural or institutional biases allowed his victims to remain unseen and undervalued? Why weren't these cases prioritized even when patterns began to emerge? These are uncomfortable questions, but they're necessary. Little's crimes don't just warn us about the existence of monsters. They highlight the dangers of neglecting those living on the edges of society, and the importance of creating systems that ensure justice for everyone, no matter their circumstances. One man's legacy, countless lives lost. By the time Samuel Little passed away in 2020, he left behind a legacy of pain, destruction, and unanswered questions. He never apologized for his actions. In fact, the confessions seemed to provide him with an odd sense of pride, as he recounted his achievements. For him, the number 93 was a badge of infamy, a twisted claim to fame. But for the families of his victims, those 93 represent people who deserve to be remembered. Mothers, daughters, sisters, and friends taken far too soon. And for the rest of us, they represent a sobering reminder of what happens when society lets people slip through the cracks. The past and shocking motives. To understand how Samuel Little became one of America's most prolific serial killers, you have to start at the beginning, a childhood wrapped in hardship, deprivation, and early signs of destruction. Samuel Little wasn't born a monster. He wasn't destined to be one of the most infamous names in American criminal history. But through a troubling blend of poverty, lack of guidance, psychological predispositions, and societal apathy, he became something far more sinister, a predator who would leave a legacy of pain that spanned decades. Samuel's past carries clues to the chilling motives that drove his depravity. Born into instability, he became a product of his environment, shaped by rejection and cruelty. His life was marked by factors that play into far too many devastating crime stories in America: a broken home, racial inequality, psychological trauma, and unchecked violence. A troubled beginning. Samuel Little was born on June 7, 1940 in Reynolds, Georgia, into a life that seemed doomed from the start. His mother, presumed to be a sex worker, gave birth to him in the heart of the segregated South, a world already rife with inequality and prejudice for an African-American baby boy born into poverty. Samuel later claimed that he had never known his father, and there were whispers that his mother often left him in the care of relatives or even strangers, while she worked the streets. Some accounts suggest that he was abandoned altogether in his early years, left to navigate the world without the stability of a nurturing parental figure. Samuel often spoke of his childhood with a mixture of resentment and detachment, hinting that his relationship with his mother was deeply strained. Whether she neglected or mistreated him remains unclear, but his growing resentment toward women, particularly those in positions of vulnerability, can be traced back to this fractured foundation. By the time Samuel was a young boy, his family had moved to Lorain, Ohio, a gritty industrial town where dreams often faded under the weight of factory smoke and economic uncertainty. Life in Ohio wasn't any kinder to him. He struggled in school, often clashing with authority and displaying early signs of behavioral issues. Teachers described him as inattentive, isolated, and prone to violence, while classmates simply avoided him. Samuel wasn't a likable boy. He was angry, withdrawn, and harboring a simmering rage that no one seemed to notice or care to address. The first signs of obsession. While many peers were dreaming of futures, Samuel was locked in a private and sinister world. From a young age, Samuel exhibited a dark, obsessive fascination with women, an unhealthy fixation he would later confess centered specifically on their necks. He recalled how he would sit in school daydreaming about the curvature of a woman's throat, or the way a necklace would rest against soft skin. For Samuel, this was no ordinary curiosity. It was something deeper, darker, and far more dangerous. Psychologists who studied Samuel after his arrest drew a direct connection between this bizarre fascination and his later crimes. His obsession with the neck wasn't just a preference, it became the focal point of his attacks. Strangulation for Samuel was deeply intimate. It offered him total control, feeding his unquenchable thirst for dominance while fulfilling the twisted fantasies that had consumed his mind since childhood. A life of petty crime and violence. As Samuel aged out of childhood, his future looked anything but bright. By his teenage years, he was already on the wrong side of the law. Arrests for theft, burglary, and petty crimes began stacking up, each one evidence of a young man spiraling farther away from societal norms. By the time he was 16, he had already spent time in juvenile detention facilities, experiencing firsthand a system that seemed intent on punishment rather than rehabilitation. But these acts of delinquency were just the beginning. Beneath the surface was a far more menacing pattern: physical violence, particularly against women. Samuel used his size and strength to intimidate and overpower, honing the skills he would later use in his killings. His attacks on women began as assaults, violent, controlling acts meant to subdue and demean. As the years passed, these assaults escalated to attempted strangulations and kidnappings, foreshadowing the horrors that lay ahead. A nomadic killer's evolution. What set Samuel apart wasn't just his willingness to harm, it was his ability to adapt and evade capture. By the time Samuel was in his 20s, he had fully embraced the life of a drifter. He traveled across the country, moving from state to state, never staying long enough to draw attention. This transient lifestyle made him incredibly difficult to track, especially during the 1970s and 1980s, when law enforcement lacked the technology and interdepartmental coordination needed to connect crimes across jurisdictions. Samuel often lived on the fringes of society, staying in cheap motels, car parks, and ramshackle shelters. To support himself, he worked low-wage, transient jobs: grave digging, janitorial work, truck driving. These jobs required no background checks, no identification, and no questions, giving him the perfect cover to continue his deadly spree undetected. But his nomadic life wasn't just about survival, it was about opportunity. Each new town brought new prey, women who wouldn't be missed, women the world already ignored. Samuel learned to blend into his surroundings, charming his way into conversations, disarming would-be victims with a calm demeanor and an easy smile. He was a chameleon, adapting to the underbellies of cities across America, always looking for his next victim. The motive: power, domination, and control. What drove Samuel Little to kill? For decades, this question confounded psychologists and investigators alike. In his confessions, Samuel revealed twisted motives that were as chilling as they were illuminating. First and foremost, Samuel's crimes were about power. Having grown up feeling powerless and rejected, his murders were acts of total domination. Strangling his victims allowed him to assert complete control over their lives, even their final breaths. It wasn't enough for him to kill. He relished the process, the struggle, the realization of his victims that they couldn't escape. In interviews, Samuel described how he would watch and wait for the moment his victims stopped fighting, calling it the best part. For him, murder wasn't about hatred or revenge, it was about savoring the ultimate display of authority. "I felt like God," he once admitted, an eerie smile creeping across his face. This sense of godlike power became an addiction, one he fed over and over again, leaving a trail of heartbreak and devastation in his wake. A society that failed to stop him. While Samuel's motives were deeply personal, there's no denying that society itself played a role in enabling his crimes. The systemic racism, sexism, and classism of the American justice system allowed Samuel to remain invisible for nearly half a century. He operated in a world where his victims, black women, sex workers, drug addicts, were often dismissed as unworthy of attention. Their deaths were written off as accidents or drug overdoses, with little to no investigation. Samuel himself admitted that he chose victims whom he believed no one would care about. "I knew nobody was going to go looking for them," he said. And tragically, he was often right. His ability to exploit society's apathy became the linchpin of his decades-long killing spree. The birth of a monster, Samuel Little's transformation into America's most prolific serial killer wasn't instantaneous. It was a slow, relentless evolution, shaped by his past, fueled by unaddressed psychological dysfunction, and enabled by a society that looked the other way. From a neglected child in Georgia to a drifter haunting America's highways, Samuel Little's story is one of compounding failure, a grim reminder of what can happen when broken systems and broken people intersect. His motive wasn't money or revenge, it wasn't madness in the traditional sense. For Samuel, the answer was chillingly simple. He killed because he wanted to. He killed because he could. A rare cooperation. In the annals of American criminal history, killers like Samuel Little are typically defined by one thing: silence. They don't talk, they don't confess, they don't assist authorities. Yet, in a bizarre twist, Samuel Little, a man who evaded justice for decades, who preyed on the most vulnerable, and who left a trail of heartbreak across the United States, would break his silence. And when he finally did, it wasn't out of remorse or guilt, but for reasons far more self-serving. His unlikely cooperation would become one of the most extraordinary examples of criminal collaboration in history, unraveling secrets hidden for half a century. The unlikely proposition. When Samuel Little was arrested in 2012, he didn't immediately reveal himself as the nation's most prolific serial killer. At the time, he was an aging, frail man, initially suspected only in a few cold cases that DNA evidence had tied to him. In 2014, he was convicted of 3 murders, those of Carol Alford, Audrey Nelson, and Guadalupe Apodaca, and sentenced to life in prison without parole. By most accounts, that should have been the end of his story. Another brutal killer locked away, the world none the wiser to the full extent of his depravity. But Samuel Little's story wasn't finished. In 2018, while housed in California State Prison, Little did something virtually unprecedented for serial killers. He offered to talk. For decades, he had laughed in the face of law enforcement, delighting in his ability to evade capture, but now, in his 70s and facing the end of his life, he saw an opportunity, a chance to maneuver himself into a position of comfort. The unspoken agreement was clear. Little wanted something tangible, a transfer to a prison with better medical care, improved amenities, and more humane conditions for an ailing old man. In exchange, he would provide information. He would confess to murders, not just 3 or 4, but dozens, crimes no one even realized had been committed. The decision to listen rested with Texas Ranger James Holland, a seasoned investigator known for his persistence and skill in coaxing confessions. Holland took the gamble, initiating a line of questioning that would stretch over 700 hours of interviews that would change the landscape of criminal investigations in the United States forever. What Holland found in Samuel was both a confession machine and a horrific window into humanity's darkest urges. Samuel Little starts talking. Once Samuel began speaking, he didn't stop. Over the next year he sat calmly, matter-of-factly in an interrogation room recounting his crimes one by one. There was no shame, no hesitation. Samuel was eerily methodical in his answers, as if replaying a highlight reel in his mind. "I killed her in 1977, he said flatly to Holland about one of the victims. "She was light-skinned, a black woman, about 25, small waist. She fought hard, but I overpowered her, dumped her in a creek. I don't think anybody found her." These weren't rehearsed statements. Samuel's answers dripped with intimate details, how the victims looked, what they wore, where he left their bodies, the unique angles of their final moments. He spoke the way someone might describe a mundane chore, which sent chills through even the most seasoned investigators. What startled law enforcement the most was how many of these confessions were tied to unsolved cases, or cases no one knew were murders at all. Samuel described his killings across 19 states, spanning 3 decades, from California to Florida, from the bustling inner cities to the sleepy rural fields that became the backdrop for his victims' graves. His memory was astounding. He couldn't always recall the dates, but he could paint each horrific moment with precision: the shape of a victim's face, the laughter that made them trust him, the exact spot where he left their lifeless bodies. The importance of cooperation. What set Samuel's cooperation apart wasn't just the sheer scale of his confessions, but the depth of the information he provided. For decades, law enforcement agencies across the U.S. had operated with fragmented systems. A body discovered in Florida rarely connected to an unsolved missing persons case in Texas, even if the circumstances matched. The disjointed nature of the justice system, combined with indifference to marginalized victims, had allowed Samuel to continue his killing spree uninterrupted. Now, sitting face-to-face with James Holland, Samuel bridged those disconnected dots himself. He offered stories that reached far beyond the cases for which he had already been convicted. His confessions brought closure to victims' families who had long given up hope of learning what happened to their loved ones. Women who had been listed as Jane Does for decades were finally given names, their stories reclaimed from the shadows. The role of victim sketches. Perhaps the most surprising contribution from Samuel's cooperation was his willingness to draw. Using colored pencils and paper provided by law enforcement, he began illustrating his victims from memory. These sketches weren't simple outlines. They were hauntingly detailed, capturing expressions, face shapes, hairstyles, and even the smallest physical quirks. To him, they were trophies, reminders of lives he claimed. "These are my babies," he said chillingly as he finished one drawing. "I never forget a face." Law enforcement officers and victim advocacy groups distributed the sketches across the country, hoping that families, friends, or anyone looking for a missing loved one might recognize one of the faces. The response was overwhelming. Tip lines began ringing with calls from families who thought the drawings bore eerie similarities to those they had lost. Suddenly, cold cases began thawing, one by one, with Samuel's sketches filling in the horrifying blanks. No remorse, just calculation. Throughout his collaboration with authorities, one thing was glaringly absent: remorse. Samuel Little wasn't confessing to lift the weight of guilt off his shoulders. He wasn't seeking forgiveness. Each answer, each name, each chilling detail came not from a man grappling with moral reckoning, but from someone who saw his cooperation as leverage, a way to gain comfort in his final years. He wasn't sorry for what he had done. If anything, his confessions seemed to give him a twisted sense of pride. He spoke about his ability to evade the law for so long, his skill at luring victims, and his understanding of society's indifference as if they were accomplishments in a sinister resume. "Y'all thought there was only 3 of 'em," he sneered during a confession, "but there were 93. Redemption for the forgotten." Despite his lack of remorse, Samuel's cooperation transformed the lives of many families and communities. For grieving mothers, fathers, siblings, and children who had waited years, sometimes decades, for answers, his confessions brought a measure of closure. Long-forgotten files, once buried in dusty police archives, became active cases again. Detectives worked tirelessly to cross-reference Samuel's accounts with local records, using his information to offer closure to shattered families. This rare collaboration between law enforcement and a remorseless killer is perhaps one of the most bizarre and haunting alliances in criminal justice. Samuel Little's confessions not only shed light on his monstrous life, but also forced the country to confront how far the justice system and society itself had failed his victims. A grim legacy. Samuel Little's cooperation didn't absolve him of his crimes. It didn't transform him into a hero or a man seeking redemption. Instead, it was a chilling reminder of the scope of his violence. It spoke to his calculating nature, how even his confessions were transactions. But whether motivated by comfort or his own vanity, Samuel's decision to talk gave voice to the voiceless. For the first time in decades, the women he killed were no longer just Jane Does. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, and friends. They were real, and through Samuel's words, their humanity was restored, even as his monstrous legacy loomed large. The end of a serial killer. After decades of haunting America's shadows, Samuel Little, the country's most prolific serial killer, met a quiet and unremarkable end. On December 30, 2020, at the age of 80, Samuel Little died in a California hospital while still in prison custody. His death wasn't dramatic or cinematic. There was no startling confession on his final breath, no moment of remorse that might offer closure. Instead, the man responsible for a crime spree unparalleled in American history passed away alone, shrouded in the dark legacy of lives he had destroyed. But even in death, Samuel Little's story leaves a profound mark on the fields of law enforcement, criminology, and public consciousness. It raises chilling questions, not only about the cruelty he inflicted, but about the failings of society that allowed him to thrive undetected for decades. A fragile end to a life of violence. When Samuel Little entered prison in 2014 after being convicted of 3 murders, he was already an old man. Gone was the powerful physique of his younger years, the calm and calculated predator who used his hands to strangle countless women. What remained was a frail, graying inmate suffering from numerous health problems. Diabetes, heart disease, and other complications began chipping away at his physical strength, turning him into a hollow shell of the man he once was. By the time investigators reopened some of his cold cases in 2018, Samuel Little had become bedridden and relied heavily on a wheelchair for mobility. He looked harmless, an elderly man who could barely complete a full sentence without pausing for breath. Yet, despite his fragile condition, a terrifying intensity lingered in his pale eyes. Those who spoke to him could still see the calculating mind behind the worn-out body, the same mind that had ruthlessly hunted victims for over 3 decades. Death by natural causes, the inevitable end. Samuel died of complications linked to diabetes and heart disease while serving his life sentences at the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. He had long been expected to live out his final days behind bars, but when news of his death surfaced, it left a hollow kind of relief. For the families of his victims, his passing brought an official end to his reign of terror. No more confessions, no more headlines, no possibility of escape. And yet, his death left unanswered questions, a gnawing absence of the full truth. What did Samuel Little truly think in his final moments? Did he replay the faces of his victims in his mind as he so often claimed to do during his confessions? Did he feel regret, remorse, or any ounce of guilt for the lives he had stolen and the pain he had inflicted across the country? Or did he die as he lived, cold, indifferent, and unrepentant? Investigators who worked closely with him believed it was the latter. Samuel Little had, after all, shown an almost pathological pride in his actions, taking his crimes as personal accomplishments rather than sins. The lasting impact of his death. When a murderer of Samuel Little's magnitude dies, the ripples of their actions don't end with their passing. His death removed any chance of further interrogation, any hope of recovering additional information about the victims still unknown. Samuel had provided sketches, descriptions, and chilling accounts of over 93 murders, but many of these cases remain unsolved. Skeletal remains lie in unmarked graves, their names still unrecovered, their stories frozen in time. For families still searching for closure, Little's death felt abrupt. It was as if the window to a painful but necessary truth had been slammed shut. A mother waiting decades to learn the identity of her daughter's killer might never hear confirmation. Brothers, sisters, and children of Little's victims are left wondering, why wasn't my loved one important enough to solve their case before the killer died? A death overshadowed by legacy. Even though Little took no glory in death, not even earning a front-page obituary, the grim shadow of his crimes lingers. More than 2 years after his passing, his name remains synonymous with failure. The failure of the justice system to detect his crimes sooner, the failure of society to protect the women he preyed upon, and the systemic failure to prioritize missing persons cases involving minorities and the economically disadvantaged. Samuel Little's death quietly closes a chapter of unimaginable darkness, but the lessons surrounding his life and the horror he inflicted continue to shape how crime is investigated today. His staggering body count forced law enforcement agencies across the nation to rethink interagency communication. The fragmented justice system that allowed him to move unnoticed from state to state, leaving behind a trail of forgotten women, is now under greater pressure to integrate databases, improve DNA technology, and invest in better collaboration between jurisdictions. Beyond technology, though, his crimes force us to confront the societal biases that let Samuel Little operate with impunity. He openly confessed to targeting women whom no one would go looking for, women of color, sex workers, victims of addiction, and the homeless. His killing spree highlights a chilling truth. The world made it easy for Samuel Little to thrive because it was easier for the system to overlook his victims. Did no redemption come? Unlike other infamous killers, Samuel Little never gave investigators or the public the satisfaction of regret. In his final years, when physical pain and suffering could have softened his pride or awakened his conscience, he instead focused his mind on his legacy. He spoke of his victims with a detached fondness, as though he had bestowed upon himself the chilling right to decide their fate. For many officers, prosecutors, and psychologists familiar with his case, this lack of remorse strips away the notion that killers like him can ever change. They saw him as the embodiment of pure self-interest, a man who took lives simply because he could and because the system let him. Closure for some, but not all for some families. Samuel Little's death brought long-awaited closure. The man responsible for their loved one's murder was gone forever, incapable of inflicting harm again. But for others, his passing reopened wounds that hadn't yet healed. While Little confessed to 93 murders, only 50 of those had been definitively confirmed. That leaves over 40 cases unresolved. His death silenced the only person who might have been able to share additional details, sketches, or confessions to help connect those remaining dots. Detectives working the unsolved cases left behind by Little now face an uneasy limbo. With no suspect to interview, no access to Samuel's mind, and limited remaining physical evidence, many of his victims may never get the justice they deserve. Reckoning with a grim legacy. When Samuel Little died in 2020, the world lost more than a serial killer. It lost a wealth of secrets. Secrets about unnamed victims, buried bodies, cold cases that will never be solved. But his death also forces us to reckon with the systemic flaws his crimes brought to light. His story isn't just about what one man was capable of, it's about what we failed to do. Countless lives slipped through the cracks, overlooked by a society too quick to judge the vulnerable and too indifferent to realize their worth. No redemption, only reflection. In death, Samuel Little didn't find redemption, nor did he offer any sense of resolution. Instead, his passing serves as a stark reminder of the need to honor every life, no matter how marginalized. His victims, once invisible in life, must never be invisible again. And though Samuel Little's name may fade from the headlines in time, the voices of those he silenced deserve to echo forever, an inspiration for warning and raising awareness. This heartbreaking story serves as a lesson in showing greater care for those on the margins of society. It is not just the story of a killer, it's also a reminder of the responsibility we all share as a community.